This is the first of a multi-part series where we're going to explore the high-level overview of demographics and its geopolitical impacts. There's some takeaways I'd really love for people to get out of this. First is to give you an intuitive understanding about what's going on with a country when you glance at the country's demographic chart. Second, to help you gain some insights as to why governments behave the way they do based on demographics alone. So, for instance, how does demographics impact trade and therefore policy? Third, we talk about Bretton Woods, aka globalization, and how it couldn't have been possible without the demographic structure of the world the past 80 years. It can be argued that this is one of the supporting pillars of global prosperity over the past 80 years. And last but not least, my personal hidden agenda is that I'm a feminist, and unless we come up with solutions for the demographic challenges ahead, I see women's rights being stripped away. I'd love to get more people thinking and talking about how we might go about solving these challenges ahead. How the series of talks is structured is I'm going to start off with at the 50,000 foot view of classical geopolitics and its levers and how demographics fits into geopolitics. Then we'll hone in on demographics and talk about it from the 50,000 foot view, and we'll do a little bit of a deeper dive. So, couple notes. There will be a lot of diagrams from Peter Zeihan's works, which you're probably all familiar with. Second, I'm coming at demographics from an amoral perspective. It might get a bit uncomfortable because I will talk about humans as if we are commodities, so don't at me. Let's start with a high-level overview of classical geopolitics. So, with classical geopolitics, we can use a handful of levers to understand a country or a group of countries. These days, you turn on the TV and it seems everything is about geopolitics. So, I'm going to define geopolitics the way it was defined prior to the 20th century. Classical geopolitics is the intersection of geography, resources, and policy. These are the three main levers of classical geopolitics. As a quick recap, geography impacts a civilization's culture, security, and livelihood, amongst other things. So, for instance, if you live in the inland mountains, you're probably more self sufficient and conservative than if you lived along coast where there's more trade and contact with other civilizations. If you live in a temperate region like the US, you probably have an easier life than if you lived in Russia, where the extreme cold makes life difficult. Or if you lived in the tropics like Vietnam, where it's jungle, where diseases are rampant. If you live on an island like Great Britain, or a functional island like the United States, you're going to be a naval power, which is more of an offensive power rather than a defensive power. If you have good internal transportation, and this does include both natural transportation, like a river network, and man made transportation, like rail and road networks. If you have good internal transportation, trade is cheaper, and the civilization is more cohesive, both of which contributes to a more prosperous civilization. The resources you have at your disposal is another determinant of a country's geopolitical power. For instance, if your civilization doesn't have access to make bronze, and it's the Bronze Age, chances are your civilization's surviving is slim. In today's world, food, water, and petroleum is what makes modern life possible. If you have all three, you're in a much better spot than if you only had one or two. And the last but the most important resource is human resource, and that's the study of demographics. And we have policies which influences geopolitics. These policies can be global or it could be countrywide policies. This is where Bretton Woods fits in. So now we're going to look at demography at the 50,000 foot level and why it's been said that demography is destiny. For what we care about, demography is really all about ratios. The ratio between men and women and the ratio between the different age cohorts, specifically the ratio between children to working age adults to retirees. I was really surprised by how much you could understand a country just by looking at these ratios. But because each country has their own rules around who's considered, quote, working age, the definition of working age varies. So, for instance, in the US, working age is roughly 18 to 65. In other countries where education is not as valuable, working age may start at 14. In other countries where retirement age is lower, it may be until 50 years old. So what is, quote, working age is variable. But overall, we'll use 20 to 65 to make explaining demographics easier. We'll do a bit of a deeper dive into demography and look at it at the 10,000-foot level. These are the topics we'll cover the rest of the series. We'll start with the theory in the left column, and then we'll dive into examples in the right column. In part 1, which is this video, we'll tackle the basics of demography, and we'll look at GDP. Let's start with the basics of demography. We're going to learn how to read that pyramid. This is the demographic chart for Angola in 2005. The blue is the number of males, the pink is the number of females. Each horizontal bar is a 5-year age cohort. So the bottommost bar are children ages 0 to 4. The wider the bar, the more people there are in that cohort. So because the 0 to 4 bar is the widest, it is the largest cohort. We're going to overlay the major cohort groupings over the pyramid. We have children who are roughly aged 0 to 20. We have retirees who are over 65. And then we have the working age adults who are between 20 and 65. The working age cohort can be split further into 1, the production and consumption cohort, roughly between 20 and 50, and 2, the investment cohort, roughly ages 50 to 65. The easiest to discuss are the children and retirees, so let's start with that. Children are considered economically insignificant contributors to society. They don't work and they don't spend their own money. They spend their parents' money, but they're not making any money. And it costs both society and their parents money to house, clothe, feed, and educate children, so they take up a lot of resources. Similarly, retirees are economically insignificant contributors. They don't earn money and they spend very little. And like children, they take up resources through social services. Let's focus on the working age cohorts. Roughly the age of 20 to 50 is the production and consumption cohort. They typically spend more than they make. They're buying homes, cars, paying for college and kids. They consume a lot, and they're relatively inexperienced workers, so labor costs are cheap. The investment cohort typically have paid off their mortgage, their kids are out of college, out of the house, cars are paid off, they're probably in management positions and make more than the consumption cohort. They're looking at retirement on the horizon. Now, these are people who have low expenses, high income, so they are cash rich. This is where a country's bulk of taxes and investments come from. We're going to overlay the major cohort groupings over the pyramid. So this is the standard pyramid distribution. This shape has been the demographic norm for thousands of years. Smallest group is retirees, so they pose a small burden to society. There's a small investment cohort, so innovation is slow, capital costs are high, and there's not a lot of government spending because there's a small tax base. There's a larger production and consumption cohort, so labor is cheap and goods are expensive. And there's a large children cohort, so there's a lot of money going towards maintaining these children. We're going to simplify things and just use shapes to help us understand demographics. So our standard population pyramid looks like a simple triangle. Let's pretend we have a demographic chart that looks like this. What can we deduce? There was a recent and huge baby boom. A lot of resources are being poured into these children. Here we have a huge consumption class. There was a baby boom 20 to 45 years ago. Workers have a lot of debt. They spend more than they make. This is an import-led consumption economy. In order to have enough goods for this consumption cohort, they have to import. Lots of young, less skilled workers here, meaning less expensive labor. And other countries really, really want to do business with them. They want to enter into this large consumption-driven market to sell things to them. And they want to build factories in this country because labor is just cheap. Here we have a huge investment class. There was a baby boom 45 to 60 years ago. Workers are highly skilled. Labor is expensive. Most of their debts are paid off. So high income, low spending. There's not much of a market to sell to because the market is, the 20 to 50-year-old. There's a large investment class who's worried about retirement. So what they do is they just flood their market with the capital, and it pushes down capital costs. This is a high growth, high production, high investment economy. There's a huge tax class, meaning relatively low taxes. This is an export-led economy. This is also an innovation economy because lots of capital to few innovation and risky projects, which means this is also a bubble economy, funneling lots of capital into ridiculous markets. So this is the real estate bubble, the tech bubble, the China bubble. Here we have a huge retirement class. There was a baby boom 65 plus years ago. This is an economy in trouble. There's tons of money going into social services for these retirees. The debt burden on the economy is high. In a democratic country, can't really change this easily because retirees are a huge voting bloc. Taxes will skyrocket for the investment cohort to pay for the social services for these retirees. Social services will be cut because there just won't be enough money, and capital becomes very expensive. There's a lot of elderly people, meaning we have a large, cranky conservative voting bloc. This is the shape of a stable or age demographic. Progress and innovation is steady, but not fast. What if we have something like this? You have all the benefits of a large investment and large consumption class. Best of all worlds here, and the negatives are minimized. So we have various shapes that go with how different economies function. Let's look at demographics and GDP. Remember that each cohort brings something to the table for the country. The retirees are the country's wisdom and experience. The investment cohort determines how capital rich and therefore how fast an economy can grow. These are the people who make up the bulk of the investments and taxes. The production and consumption cohort determines the health of the consumer class and therefore how fast an economy can grow. And the children cohort determines the country's future. So let's look at GDP. From Econ 101, GDP equals consumption plus investments plus net exports plus government spending. And by consumption, we mean domestic consumption, and by investments, we mean investments into said country. Let's overlay this equation atop our knowledge about demography. GDP equals consumption. Well, that comes from the production and consumption cohort, plus investment, which comes from the investment cohort, plus net exports, which comes from the investment cohort, plus government spending, which comes from the investment cohort. Without the working cohorts, a country does not have much of a GDP to speak of. Is there any wonder why countries are raising retirement ages? Each cohort plays a role. Without the retiree cohort, we have a lack of experiential knowledge. No investment cohort, meaning no capital, no innovation, no tax base. Without a production and consumption cohort, there are no markets and no one making the goods. And finally, without children, there is no future. Side note, for trade to exist, there are two parts to the equation: production and markets. It is not enough to just produce goods. You must find a market to sell the goods to. Automation only solves the production part of the equation. You can make all the stuff in the world, but if you have no one to sell your goods to, there is no trade. And if you're a country that only produces and forces your goods onto unwilling markets, that's called mercantilism, and historically speaking, that's a declaration of war. China. In part 1, we focused on the basics and GDP. In part 2, we will continue on expanding those basics and building more theoretical knowledge. We'll look at trade and a country's total fertility rate, or TFR. I'll see you there.